Brilliant. Okay, a very warm welcome once again. Just to introduce myself, my name is Amit Chadha. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Director of Programs here at Claw Social Leadership. We're very excited to be getting stuck into this really important discussion. So, this Leaders Now discussion is titled Decolonising the Social Purpose Sector. And before we begin, I just want to take a moment to set the scene really, and name what it is that we mean when we talk about decolonizing the social purpose sector. And actually, just as importantly, what we don't mean, so that we've got a sense of what it is that we're talking about and some of the parameters for this big conversation. So for many of us working in social purpose roles, the systems, the contexts that we're operating in were not necessarily designed with all of our lived experiences in mind. They can be rooted in colonial histories, hierarchical ways of organizing power, and also assumptions about leadership, what that looks and feels and shows up like, and expertise that might center some voices whilst perhaps marginalizing others. So in all of our work where we're serving communities and seeking to create social change, these systems can become real barriers, not just in doing the work and seeing impact, but also how we feel and experience ourselves and our work as leaders. So decolonizing in this context, it isn't a single action or a finished sort of destination. It's a way of noticing and questioning whose knowledge is valued, who gets to lead, decide, and define success, and how do we move away? And that's what this conversation is starting. How do we move away from these limiting systems and towards systems that share power and center equity? So today's question and conversation isn't about having all the answers or offering a niche framework for something so complex and nuanced. This is big with many possible entry points. But our intention today is to open up a space to begin unpicking some of these dynamics together in an honest dialogue. So we hope that this will be the first of many conversations where future sessions, future outputs and articles from us can zoom in more deeply on some of the themes that emerge today. So before I introduce our panelists and before we begin, I just want to invite us into this space with curiosity and care for ourselves and for everyone else on this call today. This is about learning, unlearning, and imagining a more equitable social sector and what that could look like together. Just to say, there might be some moments that feel a little bit uncomfortable or triggering. We're bringing ourselves and our experiences to this space, which I'm really grateful for. So please do prioritize your well-being. If you need a moment just to step away, please do whatever makes you feel comfortable and good. That's really, really important. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to the experts who are here to share their perspectives and experiences. So they're going to introduce themselves. I'm going to hand over to John.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here and to see so many of you in this room. My name is John Cornejo, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a consultant focusing on anti-oppression in the charity sector, particularly around communications and campaigning, but it also can be quite broad and take you in lots of different directions. I'm also an organizer with Charity So White, and we have been doing a lot of work recently around white supremacy culture, and particularly focusing around the ways that redundancies are sort of going through our sector and how white supremacy shows up within those processes and those decisions. So yeah, lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much, John. A real pleasure to have you. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Natalie.
Hi, my name is Natalie Elaine. I'm a culture and belonging consultant. I currently work for 7PK as an EDI project officer. 7PK is an organisation that works to support people in disadvantaged situations by improving their access to opportunities, networks, and experiences. We do programme design and delivery, training, and various levels of consultancy, so from organisational to policy research. And primarily, we cover social mobility for young people and EDI support. Lovely
Wonderful.
to meet you
Thank
all.
you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to have you and Halima.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Halima. I've got a background in the third sector, spanning across nearly 20 years now, predominantly in the youth sector. So I've worked from central government to local government to youth services, focusing on violence on young people, violence against women and girls, youth justice, policy, lots and lots of things. I'm currently working for Triumph. That's a organisation working across the whole of the UK that's directly addressing inequity within the arena of race and our experience in the youth sector specifically. Really good to be.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So much wisdom and expertise amongst you. Really looking forward to getting stuck in. So I'm gonna open with a question, and then we're kind of gonna go where this conversation takes us. And I'm gonna go just for this question in the same order. So starting with John, and then going in that same order for this first question, which is really again about sort of setting the scene. So my question to you is why is this discussion particularly important now? And what prompted you to start doing the work that you're doing that has this decolonial approach?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell the story really of how Charity So White started and how sort of my campaigning kind of went in this direction. So I joined the charity sector out of uni, did internships, and the whole thing of we know how hard it is to break into our sector. Found myself in my first like proper full-time job at Amnesty International, which was a dream sort of organization, but very much immediately on coming through those doors, found myself feeling completely out of place. Everyone around me was mostly white, very middle class. I particularly walking into campaigning, I remember very quickly realizing like I cannot share my lived experience. I cannot let anyone know that I was a child refugee, that I have lived experience in that side of things. And knowing that Amnesty was starting to do some work around that, and especially when a bigger campaign around refugee rights sort of kicked off, I didn't want to be sort of cast in that role of like the refugee that speaks for us, but then isn't really given the power. And I did see some of my colleagues, particularly a colleague from Syria, being very much put in that sort of role of like, let's roll out the Syrian campaigner who can talk, but then in practice didn't have a whole much of control and power over the campaigns. So experiencing all of that and engaging with internal campaigning around anti-oppression, and sort of really at that point it was just straightforward EDI and wanting more diversity. Um, Realizing that we're having a really hard fight and it feeling that isolation, and realizing that there's a lot of other people in the same boat, a lot of people from all sorts of backgrounds having that same fight in their organizations, everyone feeling as isolated as well, like their organization is the only one that's going through this and everywhere else must be better. And that's really where Charity So White comes off as a campaign, as an organization. We are primarily a collective of people of color working in the sector who have lived experience of racism in the sector, campaigning to challenge and tackle that systemic racism. And where we start going into that sort of decolonial perspective is just, for me as a campaigner, it's thinking about how white savior narratives in particular are so core and crucial to everything that we do, particularly in the international development and human rights sectors that I was in, but really across all other spaces. It is that kind of perspective where we, as privileged, often white people, although we never say that out loud, have to help the poor, unfortunate people. And I'm thinking like, that's me. I grew up poor in a poor country. I had to flee, and like, it's that disconnect between all of that. And I think the more that we have had these conversations since 2020, since the murder of George Floyd and the kind of Black Lives Matter campaign and movement that really sparked off around the world, I've seen that you have a lot of surface level conversations around EDI, some conversations about anti-racism, but it's characterized for me as a lot of people wanting to be seen as good and as a continuation of what the charity sector is supposed to be, and not necessarily willing to have the really difficult conversations about the structures that we operate in, the cultures that we live in, how professionalism is so coded within this sort of white normative lens and white supremacist lens. And I'll get into more detail later, but I've been working a lot more around white supremacy culture as a framework, and trying to sort of dig in with my clients and with campaigning targets as well, around what this really means in practices and organizations, how white supremacy shapes everything that we do and how we think. So I think it's a really important conversation to be having, and I think it's something that a lot of leaders are still really scared of.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, John. Thank you also for sharing a bit about your story and yourself. Really, yeah, really grateful for that. And yeah, we'll zoom into some of the pieces of work that you've just mentioned as well, which sounds just brilliant. So yeah, so the same question over to Natalie.
I think for me personally, growing up, I always had this kind of sense of sort of injustice, or that things were happening around me or to me, and I didn't kind of have the words to describe why, or the knowledge to understand why these things felt like deeply wrong and unjust. And I think that personal experience for me was what led me to really learn more about colonization and oppression, systems of oppression, to really kind of like empower and equip myself. So that's where the reason I started personally. In terms of 7PK, I would say that since conception, right, colonialism, decolonialism is embedded in the DNA of 7PK, because I mean, in order to support people from disadvantaged situations, those disadvantages are often linked to areas of identity, so which is inseparable from the effects of colonization. So in order to kind of, yeah, I mean, it's one in the same. We have to look at that. So for example, ideals of colonization, we have to understand that there are ideals such as some people are more capable or civilized than others, and that may link to sort of race disparity, or teachings around Christianity that have been misused maybe to control and dominate, and that could affect people, you know, subjugation based on race, or the LGBTQIA communities, for example. Another one, economic exploitation, which the global majority still feel the effects of today, and thought leadership, like the whole like Enlightenment time around the 18th century, that kind of affirmed that European reasoning and structure was right, the way that we operate our education systems and our sciences, and essentially it just discredited everyone else and everything else. And I think those are just some of the things about colonialism that we've, you know, inherited, that I think organisations such as 7PK have to acknowledge in our very DNA in order to, you know, understand the gaps if we're trying to bridge them and solve them.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Natty, so much in that. And also thank you for sharing a bit about your lived experience. But yeah, the points you're making, right, I guess this the Western centric systems, right, that we're working in. But then also the link here between those that are less advantaged, but also identity and the intersections that we hold, and how that shapes our leadership, which I think is going to maybe really nicely follow into our next question. But I'd like to come to Halima for her input on this one.
Thank you. I think similar to John and Natalie, on the position of like our personal lived experience around our own kind of internal notions of like culture, community, identity, what that meant, hitting kind of various collision points. So from my personal experience, I grew up kind of in the New Labour era, where we were sold lots and lots of dreams, lots of promises, work really hard, education, 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 go and get your degree, and you can climb social mobility ladder and you'll be fine and you'll be the same. You'll be same as your white counterpart, or a white man, or even a white woman in a position of power. And then kind of moving through the sector in various positions, that just wasn't the case. And I think, you know, I still think about this almost every day, in terms of when we think about social mobility and then our own identities applied to that. And I think, yeah, we can all have like that opportunity to go through the gate, to go through the door. But for some of us, that doesn't open, right? The gate's never opened, and we have to kind of fight through and push through. So just kind of personally, I was talking about this to a colleague at Triumph yesterday, and he was quite shocked when I said it. And I said, "Oh, did you not know that?" So my personal experience is I've got parents like my mother, not grandparents or great grandparents, that have lived through colonialism, have lived under colonial rule. In quite brutal ways, and had to flee kind of, you know, a civil war, and ended up, obviously, well, not obviously, but ended up in the UK at a time where I think we're seeing quite kind of similar realities in our communities, around the East End of London, just quite brutal and a lot of violence. And I was, you know, I think about this a lot as an adult. When I was younger, it didn't really make a lot of sense. that I come from like a lineage of women, particularly that are quite fierce. And in our household, we were not allowed to speak English because it was so important to hold on to that kind of mother tongue and our culture. And at the time, you're like, oh, this is really horrible, and everyone's really mean about this. And I think it's one of the things I'm most grateful for, kind of as an adult now. So there was a great sense of like resistance and a great sense of preserving like culture and heritage and identity that I was lucky enough to grow up with. And then going back to that point around kind of that late 90s new Labour era, where it was like a lot of like assimilation, the kind of proximity to whiteness was a marker of success. And kind of going into these spaces, we've all heard that terminology like code switching, having to do a lot of that. And I think, I mentioned like those various collision points, kind of that has happened, but for me in my life and definitely in professional life as well. And I think what we all experienced in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter kind of movement uprising around them, where it reached like a very like the hardest collision point for a lot of us. And that's how kind of Triumph came to birth and developed as an action group. And one of the things that's really purposeful and intentional about Triumph is moving away, trying our best to move away from that kind of white gaze in the work, in terms of that proximity to whiteness, understanding that the weighting of kind of power and how that happens, and even our own behaviors and how we do things and make decisions as leaders, how we kind of at times have to really reconcile some decisions that we make and say, actually, hold on, is this doing what we've always done because we've always had to, or are we in a different position now? So I think to answer the question in short, Amit, it's not like a moment that kind of like, it triggered like, this had to happen then. I think it was something that's always been a part of our identities, that's always been a part of our like notions of like space and place and how we see the sector. But now that may just be a bit stronger. We've always been trying to do the work, but it hasn't been, like that gate hasn't been open. We've been doing the work kind of in more smaller spaces or activist group where now we can, we're on a call today and we're saying the words whiteness, white privilege, we're saying white gaze, we're saying colonization, we're listed like I wouldn't have been able to sit in a space like this even 5 years ago. So I think that's an important kind of note. I'll stop there.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Again, thank you for sharing like your story and some of these important points that are coming around, in terms of social mobility, but also, your story and experience of the kind of the active preservation of your culture, your heritage, your language in a system and a world that actually is telling us to move towards, and to use your term, proximity to whiteness, and how that shapes not just how we feel and grow up and live and think, but also the work that we're doing here within this space. Thank you, all three of you. There's so many things that we can zoom into, and I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit more about, and this was first sort of sparked in John's response, and then both of you kind of talked a little bit about identity. But we talked about some of the performative efforts that we see to move towards more inclusive ways of working, and you've both acknowledged, a really crucial point in 2020 where that we saw the building and ripple effects of a movement where conversations were being had, where organizations were thinking critically and strategically, some about how to move towards this, but we're in a slightly different place and contexts are constantly shifting. So I guess the question is around the challenges that come with seeking to make these systemic shifts, right, in amongst perhaps a space and a world where we are responding, or other organizations and leaders perhaps are having to respond a bit more reactively, depending on the context, and perhaps those efforts might seem performative. And we might bring in a policy, but what does that look like in reality? How does that affect the experiences and beliefs and values of those within the organization, for example? So my question really is about our experience of those tensions, and there's lots of places you can go here, but it could be that you call on examples where you have worked to make deeper shifts, perhaps within your organization, within a community, amongst this backdrop, any reflections on successes or challenges, either one, where you've been able to move towards a shift that isn't so performative, that has enabled you to open conversations like these? I'll hold this on open. It's a big one.
I could perhaps speak about a general challenge, maybe.
Please, yeah. Thanks, Natalie.
Just gathering my thoughts. So this is an experience from my time before 7PK. And I'm going to go back to that whole enlightenment thing about how we affirm that European and Western reasoning is right. So it was like, yeah, kind of post, it was probably 2020, 2021, post the tragic murder of George Floyd. And organizations were embarking on their journey to kind of improve EDI and equity. So I was called in and I was delivering a training workshop, but I was doing it to SLT and their EDI working group. I was describing kind of the state of society, a society that we've all inherited. And I was speaking on like individualism and capitalism and the notions that our value as humans lay in like productivity and how this can affect people that are marginalized in society, such as like older people or those living with disabilities, carers, parents, those with sickness, etc. I was also speaking about the transatlantic slave trade and how that this was an economic boost to Europe and la la la. I was talking about all these things. And the most senior leader in the room, in the space, got quite disgruntled and kind of like irritated with me throughout. And he turned and he said something like, I have a master's in la la la. I think it was like economics and politics or something of the sort, something like that. And he said to me, during my degree, they didn't teach us any of that there. And I was kind of thinking, like, sir, like, if they'd taught you that, then you wouldn't be looking, you'd know the solutions. But it's kind of that thing where what I've been taught is all there is, and it has to be this or nothing. And perhaps, and not just him, it could be all of us, but perhaps he was kind of looking for the solution in himself, but just looking to be able to recognize it rather than hearing something different or realizing that all the valuable knowledge that he has, perhaps he has to sort of rearrange it in order to see the problem for what it is and then therefore the solution. So in terms of, you know, how did I address this? How did I overcome this? I didn't. I met a roadblock. There was one leader in the room with an immense amount of power who put a spanner in the works, and everyone around him sort of bent into his decision making. It was a very, very uncomfortable experience. And I know you did want to hear about a situation where maybe we win, but sometimes we don't always win. And I think it's because of this kind of colonial thought, these thought processes that need to be broken down or rearranged.
Thank you. No, I think that's so real, and you just like brilliantly like kind of set the scene and painted the picture for us. And I think lots of others will have had similar experiences and moments. And I think we have to name them, we have to talk about them. And the point you've made, perhaps about the perspective and experiences of that person you described, sure, helps us understand the context, but it's one of, I think, so many examples of where we're experiencing these tensions. I'm just going to open up the floor to the panelists.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to a couple of points on Natalie sharing there. Thank you, Natalie.
Please.
I think, you know, much of our work is dependent on, we have to acknowledge the reality of leadership in the sector. I can't quote it exactly, but I think there's a lot of white men in the sector that are called John, like in the 90%. John, you might know that stat from your work, and I think particularly board members. So we have to acknowledge that leadership is predominantly white men in the sector. And I think the just going back to what Natalie said, I think the work that we're trying to do in terms like your consultancy there in that room with SLT, it's dependent on how much those leaders in that room are willing to kind of acknowledge the truth, like accept the truth that they're benefiting from a very structured, very sophisticated, long history of kind of colonial power that has kind of seeped so insidiously into our structures that if someone said to me, pinpoint exactly what it is, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I know it's strong and I know that it's felt and I know it's unequal and it harms me. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the work that we do around kind of inequality, inequity, racial injustice is dependent on number one, acknowledging that the kind of the structures in place are people who are benefiting directly from that system, that are not from global majority backgrounds, and the kind of work to a certain extent is on them to acknowledge that and try and reconcile that before they move into that space with Natalie in that room. So they're coming already into that space to say, like that kind of acknowledgement of the privilege associated with race, white privilege, functioning in a system where they're probably recruiting all of their directors that look like them, that are from the same cultural backgrounds, that went to the same posh schools as them, probably. So I think that's dependent. Another point I wanted to just quickly make a little bit with what Natalie said there is, I think it will probably come up later on in our discussion here, but I think there's so much waiting on global majority people to like directly address that issue. The monthly forums, the kind of I can't remember the scholar, steel pans and samosas. When do we move beyond steel pans and samosas, right? Like once a month, all of the Black and brown people have to go in a room to talk about their trauma and inequality, and kind of have like that forum. Of course, those spaces serve a purpose in some organizations. I don't want to kind of discredit that sense of like connectedness that they can bring. But what about where the power lies? What are those people doing? Are they going in a room once a month to kind of decolonize their thinking and their decision making and understanding their positions of privilege that are rooted in power and hierarchies of power? So sometimes it's quite I think it kind of makes you lose your fight a bit. I've been in rooms like that, Natalie, and you're like, oh, you are really not in the room with me. Like you're really not here. You've probably been forced to do this, and there's quite a lot of anger in that space as well. You can feel it in the room, and they're kind of angry at you because you're telling them actually everything is really, really quite embedded in racist practice, and they're like, well, it's not me, and it's like we're trying to address the structure and the system. So yeah, just a couple of reflections on that, because
Amazing.
I know what that space feels like, Natalie.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just before I hand over to John, I think you've named some just really important points that we can't not acknowledge whilst having a conversation like this. That first point, I set the scene by talking about how do we move towards systems that are more equity centered, that do share power. Well, you've named it, is that people need to accept that that's the issue, that currently the systems are not equitable, that currently they are centering certain voices. And so, yeah, when you're working in a context where people aren't seeking to understand that and face that and see that, there's the barriers and challenges, but also the deflation that you just described, but also that really important point, which is that feeling that the minoritized or global majority leaders feel, which is to bear the weight of making that change. When actually they just want to be great leaders in a system that sees them and hears them and understands their experiences, right? So there's the lived experience that we carry, and all three of you have generously shared how you've been moved through your lived experiences to do this work, which is still within you in an embodied way, but we are also navigating the challenges of the systems, and therefore actively trying to make change, but with characters like the one that Natalie has described. So I really thank you for sharing that. It's important. I'm going to hand over to John.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to you both for those points. It's been a really important discussion. I am gonna start with the negative briefly because I think there's something else to add, but I am going to finish with the positive and something that has worked really well, that hopefully will be of help to some of the people in the room. I think another big challenge is whataboutism fundamentally. And this happens in a lot of these conversations I'm having, particularly any kind of anti-oppression, anti-racism workshops. There's a lot of people in the room, mostly white people, but not just white people, that are just really uncomfortable talking about race and what systemic racism is and looks like and what oppression looks like. And so to kind of deflect and avoid the topic, there is conversations about why are we only talking about race? We need to talk about other things. What about gender? What about ability? So there's often a lot of ways that particularly people that hold some or multiple positions of privilege will try and deflect the conversation away from race and towards often it's gender, often it's white women wanting to talk about gender, which is also an important conversation, but is more often than not excluding Black and brown women from that discussion. So we'll talk about gender, but it's really about the ways that particular types of white women experience gender dynamics in the workplace. We'll talk about ableism, but again, it's sort of it doesn't really get into the really in-depth discussions around how society has such a disabling effect on people and how it isn't just about making your sort of walkways a little bit wider so a wheelchair can get through. It's far deeper and far more complex to make society more accessible. So I think getting to a place where we can really kind of sit with the discomfort of talking about systems of oppression, particularly about race, is an important thing. And this is where the kind of positive approach and kind of thing that's worked for me. I work a lot with reflective practice across my work, and that kind of shows up in lots of different ways, but it is fundamentally around asking yourself and your team members, but importantly, sort of self-reflection is a really big part of it, asking yourself really deep, probing questions and being able to kind of challenge your own biases. So particularly with CAFOD and Concern Worldwide UK, I have done projects with their campaigns and communications teams trying to build really frameworks with how they can kind of embed anti-oppressive practice, particularly anti-racism, within their campaigning work. And by co-developing these guidelines, co-developing these approach, it moves it away from a document that isn't necessarily going to be looked at and a sort of policy guideline that isn't necessarily going to be sort of actioned to a set of questions and a framework for your discussions where you're really thinking about what is the narrative at play, what does the person that I'm talking to, what does the community that we're working with, what's the story that they want to tell, what do they want to get across? And it gets to a far more powerful space where you can really start to dig into your own bias. There was a particular story with my work with Concern Worldwide where they were doing a lot of work around sort of extreme poverty and sort of lack of access to resources. There was one story and I was really impressed with Concern because they like their comms packs from teams on the ground are huge, massively in depth. It's not like the page of A4 that I had at Amnesty to work with to build a campaign around. It's like huge, full notes of all the conversations they had. But still, you were ending up in the same place of kind of white saviorism and kind of very straightforward classic charity narratives. This young man, I think he was about 17 or 18, took their researcher a whole big long trip of how difficult it is to get water, the long treks that he has to go on, and how he wanted to get across. Like, if I have to do this sort of 8 hours there and back every day to get water for my family and the sort of local people, I can't go to school. I can't do this. I can't focus on my own well-being and sort of bettering my life and achieving my dreams. And despite having this kind of essentially spoon-fed to them as a narrative, like this is what I want your supporters to get it from my story, you still ended up with this kind of slightly dehumanizing drone shot of how bad the landscape is, how sort of hard the journey is, and you still ended up in this sort of like situation where his humanity was kind of lost. And it's having those conversations and digging in, like, what do these people actually want to tell us? What are the things that they want to get across? What are the hardships that they want to get across? How do we give them agency within something as complex as malnutrition, where even the act of a mother not feeding herself to try and feed her children and getting to a clinic, that in itself is her doing something for her children. And we need to include those aspects in our stories to make sure that we're sort of acting from a place of humanity. But I do think that sort of within both of those organizations, this approach of having more reflective conversations and sort of in more deeper sort of reflections at team level has shifted and changed the ways that copy is presented and sort of products are put out. So there are ways of doing this, but it involves us really challenging ourselves and our colleagues and really kind of asking ourselves difficult questions about how bias shows up in the day-to-day.
Mhm. Thank you so much. That was such a rich contribution. I want to comment on all of it, but I won't because of time. But I just want to highlight all of you actually in some way have mentioned sort of frameworks, and I know that in your work you've been building different kinds of frameworks, and you've mentioned that. And there's a couple of things I want to point to the importance of understanding what the tools or the origins of the tools and the frameworks that we might choose to use in our work as social purpose leaders. And that's shifting. We're all learning and we seek to, learn more and more and more about the tools. But when you're able to design framework that center the experiences that we're talking about, things can shift. And actually, it's on us, perhaps, as social purpose leaders, to interrogate and to inquire and to ask those questions about what are the frameworks that we can choose to write for this, to bring into this. What can we reimagine? Because it's in all of our gifts, whether we're global majority or not, perhaps to interrogate frameworks that don't center equity or reflect the lived experiences of those that we serve and that work with us. The other point that you mentioned, John, and actually has come through in everyone, is the importance of reflection. And I guess this is maybe a bit of a takeaway, perhaps, for those on the call. Protecting and embedding and normalizing the time for that deep inquiry. If we think about the character that Natalie explained, we perhaps see the extreme opposite of someone who perhaps maybe is seeking to deeply inquire and reflect and interrogate and understand. And perhaps those of us who are working out how to fit in a world that just doesn't necessarily reflect us and our experiences, we might have that in our day-to-day thinking and being, and bringing that into an organizational way of being can be really powerful to move towards what you've described, John, and you've said how successful that has been. And so organizationally, with teams, even with ourselves, making sure that we are asking those probing, reflective, deeper questions that get to the roots of things, because we've kind of gone from a chat around performativity actually now to, well, we need to get deeper and start centering our frameworks, our policies, our thinking, and our approaches when things go wrong, or our strategy in that deeper understanding. I'm going to ask a bit of a surprise question. Just because it's coming through, which is, and all three of you shared something at the beginning around, like, others in the same boat, not alone in this. And I want to acknowledge, because we've talked about humanity, we've talked about togetherness. I want to acknowledge, this is a general statement, but, peoples and indigenous communities whom have undergone colonization have had usually extracted from them practices that are community centered, that are sharing power, that heal through people, that heal through the kinds of practices that you've actually kind of described. And so to use, you said at the beginning, Natalie, you were talking about capitalism and individualism and how perhaps our systems can promote hyper individualism and trying to navigate and tackle all these challenges alone. My question to you is around the importance of community, particularly for the social purpose leaders that we're describing in navigating the kinds of challenges that they might face within these systems. So my question is, how important are they? What kinds of experiences do you have of communities? Halima mentioned coming together, reflecting. We do that normally. That's an example of community where you're sharing practice, but you're also with those who see and understand in some way, perhaps the nuances of your experiences. So yeah, a question around community and how important that is for leaders like us in this space. And that's open to anyone who's got some thoughts.
I can start and kick things off.
Please.
I think community is vital, and I think sort of bringing it back to sort of power dynamics in the sector, we look up to the private sector and the kind of capitalism essentially so much within our sector that we kind of try and replicate it and almost make it worse within the charity sector. But so often I see like the voices in the community, it might be you have them nominally sign off a product that has gone through all of the kind of process of creation and all of the comms outputs, and you're giving a choice, but that person doesn't necessarily have the power to say no and doesn't necessarily have the ability to contribute in any deep and meaningful way. So you can sort of pat yourself on the back that it's a community-led process, that they have engagement, that they are signing off on the things you're saying, but they don't really have power. They're not involved in the conversations about how we get to the campaign or the product or the output that we're sort of designing. Then they've not got any voices within that. And that comes to be replicated in our leadership structures, boardrooms in particular, sort of how often our organizations do not reflect the communities that we work with. That is often most stark within things like international development, where there is so many degrees of separation between the people that are on the ground that we're helping and the organization. But it is just the same across education, sort of any number of charities that we have in this country. Um, we need to find ways of putting those people in positions of real power and authority where they are shaping decision making, they are shaping where we invest our times and resources, they're shaping the stories and the narratives that we are telling to our audiences. And that's where I think community is of most value for me.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, John. I'll open up to Halima and Natalie if they have anything else to add. I'm just going to remind those on the call as well, please do drop any questions into the Q&A. We'll come to questions in a second, and they're anonymized. If there are specific things that you'd like us to reflect on, please do use the chat. Halima, you're unmuted. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really valid, important kind of statement question, Amit. So thank you. I think I'll speak for the youth sector because that's my background, but I always kind of apply the same practice as I would in services for young people, in service to young people, with them, for them, to kind of my own framework and where that's held around community care, ethics of care, good community practice, in terms of not replicating that kind of move to individualism where we're like, as human beings, we're actually built for like touch and connection and care. That's literally who we are, right? We can't exist by ourselves. We need lots of different things. And a big part of that thing is being in community, kind of, with care, with kindness, with thoughts, with inclusion, and understanding then what that means in the professional setting. So what I'd want kind of, reflecting on my own leadership practice a lot, it's a question I think maybe some of the leaders or emerging leaders in the space probably get asked, is like, how would you describe your leadership style? How do you look after people? Well, wouldn't you look after people in the same way that you're in service to the people of your organization? Like with young people, you want them to be well, you want them to be safe, you want them to be connected, you want them to feel included. And I think how that kind of seeps in from, our organization with like strategy development, and design, is understanding what really, really good kind of participatory work looks like, and those methods that's needed, those tools that are required for like really good holistic participatory work. And then that includes within that kind of design and development, really understanding where we value kind of expertise, knowledge, skills, background, that it doesn't come from just this position or that background. Or, it's interesting, Natalie, you said that guy, stated that he has a master's degree, like everyone has. So like, can we move, like, yeah, like, so let's talk about your experience. What communities did you come from? Who looked after you? What did you contribute to that community? That's what we should be centering, right? Rather than that, I have a master's in PPE or economics or whatever he said. So I think it's that kind of journey that organizations, leaders have to take in terms of how do we practice care, how do we participate and build community, how do we keep that community engaged and nourished and fed and watered. And I think that's something that gets lost in our fight for success, our fight as leaders to the top. Like, there's been kind of the volume's been turned up on it, like people first approaches, and what we've heard in like the space of like kind of HR arenas. But I think it takes that one good leader, and I can think of a couple, that I'm really grateful to have shared space with, that are running really kind of holistic, thoughtful organizations. It takes that one good leader to make the decision to say everyone's included on this, because without everyone, we won't get to where we need to go with this. You know, like when we think about strategy design or designing a new program that's being delivered to in-need groups or something. So I think it's for me, it's of the most importance. I was talking again this week, it's only Tuesday, but I was talking again this week about kind of the power of collective movements and how we can stay in those collective movements and our kind of journey to like collective. I was talking in a different context, but collective liberation and what that means with our own individual experience. And I think good leaders do think of everyone kind of on that journey. So yeah, to answer the question in short, like community is if you're not thinking about community and how you're building it and preserving it and nourishing it, then there's a big question around like leadership style, I think.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for those reflections. And I guess another takeaway for those that are thinking about how to sustain this important work. You know, we've really shone a spotlight on the importance of finding or building community that now enables you to do all the things that you've described. And for those that are in positions where they can enable community within organizations, perhaps they're not of global majority backgrounds themselves, but are in a position where they can tangibly create and enable and support and give time to these important mechanisms and spaces for sharing. I'm going to go over to Natalie, and then I've got a couple of questions from those on the call.
Okay, I know we're kind of running low on time, but what Helene was kind of saying, it just brought sort of a specific-ish example to mind about community and how important it is to listen to the needs of community and those who are closest of the issues that we claim that we're trying to solve. So in the youth sector, for example, 7PK, we've been doing like an in-depth literature review and interviews, collating the experiences and findings surrounding interventions that work for supporting disadvantaged young people to overcome barriers. And over again, we see funders is the example I'm picking out. They have different priorities to the priorities of the organisations that work directly with the young people in the community that they're trying to help. So specifically, you'd find that organisations that work grassroots in the community, they might want to deepen their work and deepen the impact of their work in their community, whereas a funder might be like, nah, forget all of that, let's just scale. And it's kind of like there's a disconnect with the funders and the communities. There is no community with the funders, if you see what I'm saying. They are their own community in a little bubble somewhere, and the community that needs that they seek to support are completely not receiving what they need. So I think that is, in terms of the work and our impact, I think it's really important to centralize community for reasons like this. We won't be doing the work otherwise.
Such a powerful point, and I was hoping to get a few more questions in around funding, but we'll come to what this looks like in the funding landscape and how we might interact with and communicate with funders. Perhaps that's something we can build into a future session or a piece of output from us. But really important point. I'm going to come to a couple of questions. Thank you to those of you that have submitted questions. I'm going to read out one because I don't want to paraphrase, and this person's kind of been very real and vulnerable, so I want to thank them for sharing this, and I think this might be of interest perhaps to others. So I'm going to read it out and then we can respond. So, how can I sensitively enable the people who should be leading to take up space? The problem I have is that when I bring partners together to find a way forward, they are often in conflict with each other. If I try and move on from the conflict, I get accused of white fragility. How can I help without abusing my white privilege? I want to be able to enable people to take power back. It's a really sensitive question, and we might have time for one, maybe two reflections from you guys on that. Any thoughts?
I think it's a really difficult position. I appreciate that sort of feeling of like not wanting to overstep and everything else. But I think ultimately it's about coming from a place of building people up and helping them see their potential and sort of what they have. I think so often as people of color, we don't get those messages of like validation fundamentally. So I think start from that perspective of like, how can you show what you see in this person and kind of their skills and their value and kind of help build them up in that way without necessarily directly thrusting the spotlight on them and kind of setting that expectation they have to do this. But ultimately, it is just about building up a relationship and being vulnerable with that person, and in particular as well. But yeah, thank you for putting yourself out there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the person asking the question. And John, your response there about it being so relational. This is about, and we're talking here about our experiences and being seen and heard and felt by those that we're working with. So yeah, that relational approach is everything. I'm going to move on to a couple more questions because I'd quite like to get some more covered while we're here. The second one is how does liberation work fit with decolonizing work? So we've used a few terms today, like anti-oppressive practice. A couple of you have used this liberatory practice term. We've talked about shared power, and these are we're hearing these more and more, and thankfully we're centering language like this in order to make some of the change. But it is really important that we use the right terms and understand how this type of work fits together. So, how does liberation work fit with decolonial work? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know if I've got a long response to this, to the person who asked this question. Really good question. I don't think they can exist without the other. We can't have liberation without decolonization, right? We need to understand first colonization and the legacy of that, and then what it takes to decolonize our spaces, our thinking, sometimes our parts of our identities. And then the move goes towards the kind of liberation work, right? That's how I kind of hold it in my thinking. They're coexisting together, and one will be really loud and the other will be quiet, but essentially they're working together. You can't have liberation without the decolonization work. Yeah. I saw John nodding. I don't know if John's got a comment or anything to add there.
I mean, I completely agree. I think decolonization is often about like the systems themselves, understanding the sort of what we need to dismantle, what we need to deconstruct. Liberation is far more general. It's about dreaming of the world we want to build and what we want to free ourselves from. I feel like liberation in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to the deconstruction of those systems. And I think they go hand in hand, but it's important to remember that we do need that kind of bigger picture of like what we need to deconstruct rather than just this individualist approach of what do we need to free ourselves as individuals from. So yeah, but yeah, I totally agree.
Can I just say something on that? From John and then going back to the question. Kind of in my practice as well, when I've led teams, I've absolutely ensured that there's always a space to just think, right? And to kind of tap in to that creative part of our brains and our hearts to reimagine kind of what our very local environments look like, what our very local culture looks like, and then how that sits within our kind of wider environments. And I think because of the functioning of the sector and the strains of the sector, where we're very much moved really, really far away from our kind of creative thinking and our ability to really kind of colourfully, beautifully reimagine our environments. And that's something that's important in our work with people, with human beings, but that's important for our own kind of sustaining ourselves and our own thinking and our fight. And also that kind of exercise of reimagining, that creative part that we need to do. Like actually, there was a moment a few years ago in an organization where we were just doing, and someone in the team said, why do we don't need to do this. We can all decide that we stop this right now. And we push back to this local authority and say, no, we're not doing this. And we did. And there was a process that happened there was a space to just think, not even reflect, just to talk out loud and say, I don't want this anymore because this isn't in line with our beliefs, with who I am, with what the organization is. And we tapped into like that kind of creative thinking cycle and got a result that then led to, a small act of kind of resistance, and that can, that in itself is liberation in that very small context, right? So I think
Mm.
it's the framing of it and how we kind of move within that framework and understand that actually there is a lot more that we can do than what we can't do.
Thank you. And actually a really empowering, I think, note to sort of gently close on. Thank you so much for that contribution. I just want to spend a couple of minutes sort of wrapping up and thanking everyone really for their contributions. But we've talked about a few things, and as I said at the beginning, we're not this is big, and there's lots that we can spend a lot of time spending more time, sorry, discussing. But there have been a few sort of real, I think, takeaways or things for those on the call to reflect on. We've spoken about the importance of community. We've spoken about performativity in terms of efforts towards inclusion versus, making those real cultural, tangible shifts on the ground, whether that's within an organization or in a team or within our individual ways of working. We talked about the frameworks that we might use, and that kind of came up from us talking about either building frameworks that do center equity and, in a true way, support us towards our efforts to make change. So scrutinizing those that exist, perhaps developing our own, protecting time for deep inquiry, normalizing that, those that engage in it, but those that are able to enable it within their ways of working. Talks about building people up and empowering others being a relational thing. It's an active process of understanding and relating to people. It's not a thing that we can enact through a policy or a strategy or an approach. So that's a really important thing to take away, I think, for all of us. And then just, I think, a really beautiful way to finish is Halima's point around like imagination and actually resisting the systems that we know are harmful for us and making those points in those moments. And that's scary and difficult, and why we're having this conversation, because this imagination practice, which lots of us perhaps are becoming more familiar with, enables us to actually, it gives us permission to think about actually what this new way of working and being can look and feel like, and how it can serve us and the communities that we're working to support. So I just want to say a huge thank you. We've unearthed lots of really, really important things that, as I say, we'll come back to in future sessions in some form. But a huge thank you to the three panelists for your time, your wisdom, your care. It's been a really rich conversation. I also just want to acknowledge the ripple effect, the very real ripple effect of the work that is being done by leaders like yourselves, those on the call. And what's a real joy about being in a role like mine is that I get to see across thousands of alumni who are doing their thing, actually just how, yes, tough it is, but how actually these moments, the community that we build, does lead to the change that we are absolutely going to move towards in these small shifts. But it's real. So I want to just acknowledge and celebrate the work that you're doing and those on the call are doing. And finally, just to kind of connect this to our point around community, I want to just shout out a program that we are launching in a couple of weeks called Leadership Lighthouses, which is the first of its kind, really. We're very excited that it's going to be starting in a couple of weeks. It's place-based and it's focused on supporting, connecting, and building on the already fantastic leadership that exists amongst global majority social purpose leaders. The first two locations over 4 years for this place-based program will be in Bradford and Oxfordshire. We close applications in a few days, but do keep an eye on future locations if you're interested. On our website, you'll see all of our information about that. But that's a program designed by and for global majority leaders working in this space. So do have a look. A huge thank you once again. I wish you all a really wonderful afternoon. Do take some time to process, and do come back to us if you have any questions or inquiries about anything at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.